All right, so continuing on with our article trend, we're going to go and review one by a man named Alberto Bradanini called Gaza and the Heroism of Aaron Bushnell. And this is from a site called Brave New Europe, which advertises itself as politics and economics, expertise with a radical face. Alberto Bradanini is described as a former Italian diplomat. Among many positions, he was ambassador of Italy to Tehran 2008 to 2012 and to Beijing 2013 to 2015. He is currently president of the Research Center on Contemporary China. So, no, I'm going to say immediately here this is going to be someone who is in that pro Chinese Western faction. This is the sort of perspective that he's going to go and be speaking from. And this is the translation. So there is also an original version, which is posted a bit separately in Italian. All right, so this is how Alberto begins. With intelligence and empathy, Australian Caitlin Johnstone, you'll remember we dealt with her previously, invites us to meditate on the horrors of our time, staying away from the megaphone of propaganda and meditating on the circumstance. Systematically admitted by the latter that Israeli violence against Palestinians certainly did not begin today. So right up there immediately, he's going and talking about Caitlin Johnstone, who is, of course, massively engaged in propaganda. Massively. And this is, by the way, also remind you that Italy has severe problems with people who are pro-Chinese and pro-Russian. Their current leader, she is a decent person in those regards. She is a staunch supporter of the West, but like Berlusconi, who was in previously, he's an absolute bastard, just a really rotten person. So just you know, Italy does have severe problems, and this is what this guy is going to go and represent absolutely 100%. All right. In the years 1947 to 48, a time that Palestinians not coincidentally call Nakba the catastrophe, we have a population of 1.9 million. Over 750,000 Palestinians were violently driven out, while armed Zionist bands seized 78% of historic Palestine after destroying hundreds of villages and towns and massacring over 15,000 poor, unarmed Palestinians who had tried to defend their property, their family, and their lives. The Nakba is the unhealthy fruit of the Zionist ideology that developed in Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century, in whose ideological core we find political religious radicalism and the claim that Jews, nation, race, and or religion were entitled to their own state, a right that was indeed alien to any national or international norms, but derived exclusively from the so-called Holy Scriptures, i.e., the most far-fetched imaginable. So, what happened for those who don't know? Is that, yeah, there were some radical Jewish groups in Israel at that time. Yeah, radical Zionist groups. So what happened was that there was going to be a division of Israel into a part for the Jews and then a part for the Palestinians. Yeah, and so what basically happened is that they got into conflict. But here's the thing. That is, the way that he is presenting that is absolutely not true. What happened is that the Palestinians were joined by the Egyptians and the Syrians, and they went into all in and attacked Israel with the idea of pushing all of the Jews out of the land. And remember, this is after you'd had mass Jewish migration coming in from all across the Middle East to that place, and from Europe, from victims of the Holocaust. These were the primary people who settled in Israel. They were people who had been themselves victimized, who were minorities in the previous places that they lived, who had just seen an extremely violent campaign against them by an imperial power, and they were coming to Israel to go and found their own country. All right, so where the aspect of violence comes in is that before the war had started, there was basically the British Empire was in control of that land, but it had an idea to go and cede part of it to the Jewish population and part of it to the Arab population. This, by the way, was because the British had gotten Israel from the Ottoman Empire after World War I, and they had taken control of it. So, and much the same way after like everyone else was doing after World War II, they were going and generally having different parts of their empire break off and become independent because it was no longer feasible to go and control that state of mass imperialism across the world relied upon European technological superiority, and that superiority was obviously fallacious. It was no longer going to happen. Japan had proved that. There were a bunch of other up and coming nations, so it was absolutely infeasible to go and keep any empire going, even if someone wanted to go and keep it going, which, again, empires aren't particularly just institutions, so it's generally agreed upon by the general population at that time that nobody wanted an empire anymore, anyways. So, but what was happening during that time is that there was conflict that was emerging between the Jewish and Arab population in the area. And so conflict broke out. There were militia groups that were formed in both sides, and there were actions undertaken by both sides that were violent against one another. There were, so basically, the standard Jewish militia at that time, they're basically the force that fundamentally became the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. Whereas what happened with a lot of the other militias, a lot of these other smaller groups, is that you, for example, had them doing stuff like terrorist actions. And there were such a thing as Zionist terrorists at that time. So they would go and target people like Arab, upper class Arabs. You would have British officials that were targeted. But we have to remember there's another vital part that is missing here, which is that the Mufti of Jerusalem during World War II was an ally of the Nazi Germans. He conducted purges of Jews in the Palestinian area. Like, this is something that happened. This is something that these people aren't talking about. There's literally a Muslim Nazi guy who is going and conducting a religious racial war against the Jews in the area. That's why there were so few Jews in Palestine through a lot of this point in time. So just to ignore that, well, you're also going and talking about genocide and that, because of course you do. You have to go and, if at any point in time you find yourself selectively looking at history, well, you probably have the wrong idea. You're probably an ideologue at that point, a very fanatical one. No, history is you look at actions that are undertaken and you go and say, this happened, what can I go and infer from that? So in this case, we go and look at the situation at the time, which is that there was a lot of ethnic conflict around. We go and look that there were factions on both sides that were engaged in radical terroristic behaviors that included targeted bombings and killings of civilians. And we also have to look that that is not the mentality that prevailed. The Jewish mentality was not dominated by those sorts of people in the end. It was dominated by the moderate side, the side that was, yeah, it's right wing for, obvious reasons of, like, again, you just undergone a massacre. I think you're going to be a bit nationalistic after that. The moderate side, though, was the one that went out and became the primary speakers of the Jewish people in Israel, and that's why they got a lot of support. And here's the other fundamental thing. I've talked about this before, but just because a population is driven out of their historic homeland does not mean they shouldn't go and be allowed to go and immigrate back. This province of Palestine, it wasn't a country, it was a part of an empire, and that was part of the British Mandate, which included a lot of other parts. The British Mandate, for example, included Jordan and even parts of Syria. So these were all areas where, so just because there is a big part of an empire doesn't mean that you should go and then say, oh, the people who live there don't have the right to go and live there anymore. It's much like if looking at our state in North America, for example, there are native peoples who were deported to go and live in reservations far away from where they originally lived. So should they now somehow not be allowed to go and live back where they were originally from if they go and so choose to? I would think that that should actually be supported generally, to the extent which it is possible. And this also doesn't account for the fact that the point of having the Israeli Arab split is not supposed to be that the Palestinians cannot go and live in the Jewish areas. The point was simply that those would be the areas where the Jewish people would settle. And they also, for the record, when they were going and arranging for that purchase, they went and bought land from the locals. That's what they did. So the point is, they aren't going in and radically reshaping all the area and saying, oh, this, we have to go and. You have to remember, the Ottoman Empire had turned the area of Israel into a very, very bad place in a lot of ways. What I mean by that is that the Ottoman Empire had managed to go and, for example, deforest literally the entire country. So yeah, any forests that you see in Israel nowadays were literally planned by the Jewish population. They had to go and do major ecological reconstruction of the place. So the point is, they do care about that place, they care about that land. And then, in this wake of this whole Arab-Jewish conflict, well, guess what happened? All across the Middle East, all these other Jews were now suddenly getting pressured by the people that were around them to go and, because they're like, oh, we hate the fact that Jews are among us. We hate the fact that Jews are here. And all those Jews that were in the countries around the Middle East ended up in Israel. So you had the Jewish populations in these areas dropping by millions all throughout the Middle East, coming to Israel and living there. That is what happened. That is a thing that happened. So you had places like Yemen, for example, where there had been tens of thousands of Jews, and now there are no Jews anymore. No Jews in Yemen. In Saudi Arabia, you're not, again, no Jews. No Jews anywhere to be found. And so this is something that happened all across the Middle East. People came to Israel, and they left the lands, other areas behind. So it's like, okay, the Jews have left the rest of the Middle East. That leaves the entire Middle East open to all the other people that want to go and live there. And they just have the one small spot. Now, you can go and say, go and talk and say, was this the best place to go and put the country for Jews? There have been a lot of other suggestions. I'm not, again, going to go and say there's this religious mandate to have it in Israel. I get why people would want it in Israel, a sort of historical sentimentality. It was not something that was directly necessary. There were other suggestions, like there were suggestions of Uganda, and then I believe I've heard parts of Australia and that. But this is ultimately what happened. And the point is, though, with all this said and done, let's talk about the reality of today. So you can say whatever you want about whether or not the Jewish presence in Israel was justified. The reality is Israel exists as it does nowadays, and what else are you going to do now? Like, you're not going to go and get those people to go and leave elsewhere. They're going to be there permanently. To go and shift them out, well, that also would be a genocidal action if you were to go and expel the Jews from that place just for the sake of being Jewish. Again, this is something that would not be tolerated anywhere else in the world. To go and say, we don't want this ethnic group living in this country, so we're going to go and deport them elsewhere. That would be considered a genocidal action if you applied it to any other group in the world. And this was exactly what the original idea of the UN was to avoid. But what happened is, and may I remind you, that conflict immediately erupted. The Jews were attacked by a much larger force consisting of these Arabic countries and the Palestinians. And so they attacked the Jews, and the Jews ended up winning that war against substantially uneven odds. They won. And because they won, they went and pushed the Palestinians out of these areas. A lot of that was, of course, because the Palestinian populations in those areas had fled elsewhere. And so then, when they came in, they then just made that part of Israel. Alberta goes over here and he gives his own spin on all of that. And he then goes and slags off the British a bit. And also does a little bit of little bit of apologetics work, I think, for those defeated powers, those defeated empires. Which, given that was World War One, I am going to have to point out that Italy was an ally in World War One. Like that's one of the biggest things, the differences in World War One compared to World War Two. Italy was on the Allied side, mostly fighting against Austria-Hungary. So yeah, but of course this guy, yeah. All right, so then he goes on to cite Aaron's last words. My name is Aaron Bushnell. I am an active duty airman in the United States Air Force, and I will no longer be an accomplice to genocide. I'm about to perform an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people are experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it is not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal. With these words, Aaron Bushnell, on the 25th of February 2024, a heroic American soldier ended his life in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington to express to the world his rebellion against the complacency and silence of the powerful in the face of the continuous atrocities that Israel commits against the wretched humanity of Gaza. Only by raising the occult spheres of conscience and silencing the din around it is it possible to partially penetrate the immensity of this young man's gesture, a fighter whose ethical and human merit is beyond imagination. He was a meek and compassionate man who looked to the stars to escape the pain that oppressed him. Eternal honor to a young man with a heart glittering with humanity, filling the planet. Wow. So once again, they're raising this guy up like he's a martyr king, a sacrificial king. He's not. He's a person who is so often very, very, very petty. I have showed this. I went through this. These people, they're the Aaron Bushnell that they believe in is this idealistic myth. He doesn't exist. There is a real Aaron Bushnell who existed, who lived, who had his problems, who had his beliefs. That was a real person who existed. This person that they're talking about does not exist. And then the language that this guy goes into use is like the occult spheres of conscience and silencing the din around it. The immensity of this young man's gesture, human and ethical and human merit that is beyond imagination. Once more, idealism, absolute and utter idealism. That is what these people are driven by. This guy sounds like he's honestly throwing around language that is borderline traditionalist. Like, this is the sort of language that you imagine that traditionalists would use, like the occult spheres of conscience. That sounds very traditionalist. I haven't looked into this person, but that sounds like that is a possibility of what he represents. All right, we'll continue with Alberto. True, it is impossible to understand the deep-seated reasons that led a 25-year-old boy, loved and appreciated by those who knew him, to prefer death over the battle for life and justice. That said, this choice deserves to be taken as a philosophical and human icon against the lack of empathy and ethical decay of so-called Western civilization. I mean, his reasons are they help what's with a whole bunch of really loony anarchists who went and put him in an algorithmic bubble so that he couldn't understand the actual realities of the situation, and then pumped him full of only one-sided notions so that he only saw the Palestinians as the victims in this situation. Couldn't even consider the world from the aspect that the Israelis would look at. Didn't even care. He just goes and dehumanizes the Israelis as colonizers and all of this sort of garbage language, which once more just way of creating this barrier between the rational faculties and the emotive faculties that, of course, these things are take their seat in. And what a wonder that idealism finds its absolute heart in these emotive faculties. Just absolutely, like, this is what I mean by that idealism ultimately ends in mediocrity. Because there's a very beautiful thing that you can do with emotive thoughts. I'm an artist. I've read books. I mean, I've written very beautiful scenes in those books, very beautiful ideas. But to go and use all of this rage and hatred and anger and make that the seat of your ideals is just this insanity, and that's what these people have done, and they've called that compassion. We'll continue with Alberto. As a member of the U.S. military, Aaron Bushnell was ashamed to be part of a repressive system that allowed and still allows and facilitates Israel's inhuman massacres of the Palestinian people. The guilt had become unbearable for him. He did not want to resemble the agents of death, those cold bureaucrats of the Third Reich who lubricated the Nazi machine of extermination of the Jewish people. I will not be an accomplice to genocide, he added with chilling lucidity as he walked towards death, having before his eyes, we are willing to bet, the thousands of Palestinians, including children, who are extinguished every day by the vengeful Israeli fury. So let's note several things here. For starters, what's more, the Third Reich, you're Hamas went and massacred 1,400 Israelis, Jews, because they were Jews. They hate Jews because they're Jewish. And then you're going saying, oh, the Jews are the Nazis now. The Jews are the Nazis. Just this absolute and utter stupidity. Hamas has the exact same ideology about Jews as the Nazis did. The Nazis said that there's this massive Jewish machine around the world that is focused on exterminating everything good about humanity, that's focused on destroying it. And they said that all of the Western countries and many other countries around the world were controlled by the Jews, were hyper-influenced by them. This is exactly what Hamas and their supporters say about Jews now. They say that the Western governments are occupied by the Zionists, that they're manifestations of the Zionist will, that they're controlled by the Jews and the Zionists. This is what they are arguing. This is the exact idea of Nazism. They've just gone and rephrased it in a way that they've gone labeled everyone with this label of Zionism, and because they label it with that so instead of saying, oh, we hate all of the Jews, which many of them even do now, but they'll say, oh, we hate the Zionists. Oh, how terrible it is that the Zionists are occupying everything. Oh, how mean and evil those Zionists are. They're the manifestation of Satan's demonic control over all the world. This is what they're arguing, and this is the exact sort of language that we're seeing used about the Jews now by Hamas and their supporters. So the term Nazi, if you're going to go and throw that out, it has to go and be applied correctly. It has to go and be applied to people who want to go and see the end of the Jewish people. That is fundamentally what the Nazis were about. When you all break it down, they were that, and then they were Germanic imperialism. And I think that there's a very clear parallel between that sort of hyper-tribalistic imperialism and this hyper-tribalistic religious imperialism that a group like Hamas represents. Hamas, of course, wants to have the entire world as Islamic. That's their fundamental goal. That's their idea. And they view themselves as bringing that about by going and attacking the Jews and hoping to bring the entire Islamic world into an alignment with them so that they can go and start that process of the new caliphate. That's what they fundamentally want. That's their idea, their ideology. And it's apocalyptic, by the way. That's what they view the end of the world as. They view the end of the world as starting with the slaughter of the Jews, and then they view it as they're going to go to war with the pagans, which that'll be the secularists and groups like the Hindus and Buddhists in their minds. And with that, they believe that a lot of the Christian powers are going to go and align with them at the end. So the Christians will go and become Islamic, and then they're going to go and commit war on the various pagan powers of the world, and they believe they will be triumphant at that. That is the apocalyptic notion of this far-right version of Islam. It's very evil. It's a very, very evil idea. But so that's all just to say that when this person, this very foolish person, uses terms like the Nazi machine of extermination and then says that about someone who is supporting Israel, it's just absolute absurdity. So we have him talking about the Buddhist monk. The great American journalist Daniel Ellsberg saw Norman Morrison, a 22-year-old boy, douse himself with paraffin in front of the office of the Secretary of Defense, R. McNamara, in protest against the senseless Vietnam War. According to Ellsberg, those flames lit the fuels of protest throughout the country and contributed to the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which revealed the U.S.'s responsibility in that conflict. From that moment on, the pro war propaganda began to falter. You'll note that the actual act that is senseless is Norman burning himself to death, but this is because people saw that and were like, oh, wow, wonderful. Because, again, they're in that brainwashed Christian sense, this brainwashed Christian country. If it had been an old school America like it perhaps should have been, like the Native American version of America, they would have saw that as an absolutely idiotic action. They would have saw that as stupidity. Absolute stupidity. Like, why is a warrior, a potential warrior, going and burning himself alive for the sake of people that we're fighting against? Absolutely stupid. They would have seen that as absolute moronicism. But unfortunately, such cool heads have not prevailed, and instead we have these idealistic, stupid ideologies that we have to deal with. And senseless Vietnam War, well, why don't you go and talk to the South Vietnamese who came to the U.S.? Why don't you go see what their perspective on that was? I think a lot of them felt very betrayed by what the U.S. did, that the U.S. didn't stick around with them. And he talks about Catholic priest Daniel Berrigan, who had returned from Vietnam with a peace delegation, visited Ronald Brazzi, a student who had doused himself with petrol in front of the Syracuse Cathedral in protest against the war, in hospital. He was still alive a month later, Berrigan writes, and the smell of burning flesh was the same as I had smelled in Vietnam. The boy was dying in torment, like a piece of meat on the grill. My senses were invaded by the deepest anguish. I sensed the power of death in the world that was spreading in the land of burnt children. I went to Cantonsville as I did to Hanoi. On the 17th of May, 1968, Berrigan and 8 other activists broke into a recruitment office, seized the files, and burned them with homemade napalm. Berrigan is sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. So again, fanatical Catholic idealist, go figure. And once more, these people, they're not being held to account for their actions. This martyr impulse is also this impulse that, oh, because you're up against this radical evil, well, now suddenly you're going and it's not your fault that you went and burned yourself alive like a moron. Oh, no. It's the fault of the system. The system is the one that made you do it. Kind of like the same sort of way that these guys go and say that, oh, the devil made me do it, when it's actually your own stupidity or bad desires that go and make you go and do bad things. So they just want a place to go and scapegoat for these sorts of actions that they undertake, and instead of actually saying that people have their own will to go and do them, they go and say, oh, the system is evil and the system was the one that influenced them to go and do it. You know, can I just say something rather interesting? There are parts of this article that are plagiarized. Oh my gosh, this is perfect. Oh boy. Okay, so yep. So you remember that article that we just talked about from Chris Hedges? One of these two people has gone and plagiarized the other. So specifically, let's look at this part. One day, if the U.S. corporate state and the Israeli apartheid state are dismantled, the street where Aaron Bushnell set himself on fire will bear his name. That exact sentence appeared in that last article we looked at. I'm going to go and highlight it for you here. Well, fascinated. The Palestinians, now betrayed by the world, look to him as a beacon of light. This is more language. One of these guys has gone and plagiarized the other. Oh my gosh, this is perfect. Again, this is my first reading of these things, and I've just noticed that. That's just hilarious. Oh, his name is already engraved on the path of history. We are not messianic. The dead can wait. We try to understand events, but we have an intuition that his sacrifice was not in vain. It shakes the inattentive citizenry from somnolence. Exact same word. That exact same word was used. This entire paragraph is plagiarized. Embarrasses the cynical observer, forces each one to revise his banal hermeneutics, prompts the fearful to act. In the practice of the ancient Greeks and Romans, immolation was the ritual of sprinkling salt and ground spelt on the sacrificial victim. For plagiarized language? Aaron's self-immolation links the sacred to the profane, but to get that far, he had to add the ingredient that theologian Reinhold Niebuhr calls the sublime madness of the soul, one of the few weapons available to the oppressed. Wow. I wonder how much of this article is plagiarized. Let's see which one got published first. All right, so Chris Hedges was on February 29th. Yep, Alberto was one that plagiarized. This is from March 22nd. Alberto plagiarized the article. Wow. He plagiarized it from Chris Hedges. Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. I'm going to definitely go point this out. This is a great find. Great find, absolutely. I wonder who else he plagiarized the rest of it from then. That'd be interesting to look into. Because that part at the top could actually, interestingly enough, just be like the Wikipedia summary of all that. That seems like could be a very quick summary of like the Wikipedia Zionism article. It'd be very interesting to see that. Very interesting to see. Um, Even talking about like that Nazi machinery thing that you said earlier, like that was also potentially plagiarized from the Chris Hedges article. So very interesting indeed. Oh wow, and continues with the plagiarism. Yep. So yeah, he even cites Walter Benjamin and Fritz Heinel and Rika Siegel. This guy plagiarized this entire article. My gosh. Yeah, this article is plagiarized. Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. What a wonderful find. Wonderful, wonderful find. All right, let's continue with his conclusion. By his example, the martyr allows an idea to go down in history, weakens the narrative of power, and makes consciences restless. The oppressors do not lose sleep over this, yet they would do well to shut the door on them. If one can forgive the executioners, one must not forget their names, suggests the philosopher. Dear Aaron, along with your body, the power machine intended to bury your memory as well. To them, you are nothing more than fleeting, mandatory, and annoying news, a man wrapped in depression and perhaps narcissism, in search of a tragic and ephemeral glory. But this is not the case. For the rest of the world and for history, you are entitled to be welcomed into the Olympus of nobility and heroism. Brother Aaron, son of the humanity that drives us to observe with tears in our eyes the mystery of the universe along with the cruelty of humans, you may rest assured, wherever you are, that we will never forget you. Wow. Oh boy. What again? That's just it's just really hard to take people seriously when they go and massively plagiarize other people. Like my gosh. But yeah, so to that end, first he again Olympus of nobility and heroism. He burned himself to death. Like, see, this is the absolute insanity of these people. Like, they look at people who go and set other people potentially in motion, and they're like, "Oh, that's the heroic act." When it's like that person didn't even do anything. Like, didn't even do anything constructive. This is just such an again, this martyrdom mentality that they've got is absolutely insane. It's absolutely foolish. We went from old style humanity, which celebrated people that went and accomplished great things themselves, to this idea that oh, the great people is someone who goes and dies and then philosophically inspires a bunch of people to go and do stuff because they're like, oh, that look, he burned himself alive. Like, just this is insanity. Like a heroic death in old times, right? That'd be like dying in battle. But the point is that if you're dying in battle, like nobody's going to look at you as a hero if you go into battle and then just instantly die and didn't even contribute in any way. No, people look at you as a hero if you go into battle and then you're battling, you're taking down a lot of enemies, and then you fall. Well, then they're going to go and say, "Oh, you're heroic for going and doing that because you're a good warrior." That's what we're going to go and honor about you, not because you go and die. Oh, but yeah, absolutely wonderful find, and I could not, I did not. Again, this is me going in absolutely blind right now. I did not expect that to happen. I absolutely did not expect them to go and plagiarize that. I just went and clicked on a recommended article and was like, yeah, sure, I'll go and read this. I was looking for another article to go and boost out my article. But gosh, what a wonderful find.